Hi everyone, my name's Joel. I'm a product manager at R3 and today I'm going to be showing you some of the new features coming in our Q1 2020 release with Corda 4.4. So the first feature I want to talk about is a new feature that allows developers to programmatically hospitalize their flows. So Corda has the concept of a flow hospital, and it's a place where if the flow errors for various reasons, such as the database being inaccessible, the flow will be sent to the hospital where it can be monitored and where it will eventually be retried. So the flow hospital is really used for any flow error that could possibly be recovered by a retry. Now in Corda 4.3 and before, flow hospitalization was managed automatically by the platform. So the developer didn't get a choice about whether their flow was sent to the flow hospital. There was a set of pre-existing error types that would get sent to hospital and nothing else. And in 4.4, what we've done is we've added the capability for the developer to send a flow to the flow hospital programmatically. So if you see here, I have a very simple flow, this flow that gets hospitalized, and I implement flow logic, I override call, and here you can see I just throw off this new hospitalized flow exception. And this exception, when thrown, will cause the flow to be sent straight to the flow hospital. So this is a very simple example here. You can see that my flow will always be sent to the flow hospital for retries. But obviously you can also use it in more complex ways. So let's say I wanted to access some resource, and if the resource isn't available, I want to trigger a retry. Well, what I could do is I could say, for example, is create a resource here, and then say if resource is unavailable, then throw this exception, otherwise return null. And there you go. So this is a slightly more complex example, but still very simple. But here I'm attempting some operation, and if the operation fails, my flow will be hospitalized. Another flow feature coming in Corda 4.4 is the ability to suspend Corda flows for arbitrary long-running operations. So in Corda, you have the concept of flows, and for various long-running operations, the flows will be suspended. And this allows your node to do multi-threading without exposing the management of those threads to the user. So your node could, for example, in Corda, if a node's flow performs a receive call, so is waiting to receive data from a counterparty, then instead of just blocking, the flow will be put to sleep and another flow will start executing instead. But until Corda 4.4, the management of when the flow was suspended was done entirely by the platform itself. So various operations like starting a flow, waiting to receive data, writing to the database that would cause the flow to suspend. But in general, the developer didn't have any control over that. And what we've added in Corda 4.4 is the ability for the developer to specify their own long-running operations that they want the node to suspend for. And so if you use this new mechanism, then let's say you're doing a long-running operation like a web request, you can ask your flow to suspend for the duration of that web request and then start processing again once the web request finishes. So we can look at what this looks like. So I'm going to start first of all down here, and I've defined this class retrieve Bitcoin readme, which implements this flow external operation class. And so flow external operation is its interface, and it has a single method execute. And execute is the method where you define the long-running operation to be performed in a non-blocking way. So the code that you write will be just regular code. It won't be asynchronous code, but the platform will execute that operation on a separate thread and not block the main threads being used for the execution of flows. Now, because the flows can be retried if there's an error, for example, you also need to pass in a deduplication ID. And this deduplication ID allows you to pass in some unique identifier that allows the remote service to establish whether this is a brand new request or a previous request that's being replayed. For example, if your request isn't idempotent or you want to do some memorization. So if we go back to where this is implemented, so I've implemented this interface, this flow external operation interface. And what we're doing here in our execute is just a very simple example where we're creating a new HTTP client, and then we're using that to make a request to go and retrieve the Bitcoin README. So here we build a new call, we build the request, we execute it, and here we can see again we're using Hospitalize Flow exceptions. So if for some reason there's an IO exception and the request doesn't complete correctly, then we just send this flow to hospital. But otherwise we will retrieve this Bitcoin README, we'll download it, and we'll return the Bitcoin README as a string from this operation. Now this is a very simple example. You wouldn't want to, for example, build a new HTTP client in every single execute request. You probably want to have one long-lived HTTP client, but this is just example code here. So we have this flow external operation to go and retrieve the Bitcoin README. And obviously that's going to be a relatively long-running operation. You don't want to do that while you're blocking other flows, especially if you're running many flows at once. So we've defined this as an asynchronous operation. And then up here, we've got our flow that performs suspendable operation, just a regular flow logic. And here inside call, we create an instance of our asynchronous operation. So here, retrieve Bitcoin README. And then we use this new method called await. And await takes an asynchronous operation and puts the thread to sleep, suspends it, executes the operation on a separate thread, and then revives the flow when the operation is complete. But you can see here there's no need for the developer to write their call in an asynchronous way or to manage the sleeps themselves. They just write a simple request, and Corda will manage the suspension of the flow and the reawakening of the flow as well. So here we have a very simple flow, and when we execute this flow, what we'll see is that the flow will temporarily suspend, probably for such a short time we won't really notice it, and it will reawaken once this web request is completed, and it will return the Bitcoin README to us. So let's take a look at a demo of these features. So here I am inside the console of Node A. So I've deployed these flows onto Node A so we can take a look at them now. So if I look at the list of flows the node has installed, we can see here it has this flow that gets hospitalized flow, as well as the flow that performs suspendable operation flow. So let me start by kicking off flow that gets hospitalized. So I can say flow start flow that gets hospitalized. Kick it off there. And what we'll actually see is that this flow doesn't return. And that's because it's actually already been sent to the flow hospital. And so I can show you that by jumping into the node's logs. And here, if we see at the bottom, it's rather small, but we can see there's a flow hospitalization exception that's been thrown, ouch, and the flow has been sent to the flow hospital. So we can see here, flow error kept for overnight observation by this staff flow hospital sedation nurse. So the flow will be kept there, and then it will eventually be retried. Now let's take a look at the other feature, the ability to suspend a flow for a long-running operation. So I'm going to jump out of that flow. That will still be in the hospital now. And instead I can start the flow that performs suspendable operation. So I do flow start, flow that performs suspendable operation. Kick that off. And there you can see. So what we've got here is the Bitcoin README, which has been downloaded via this REST request. So here the long-running operation was actually not very long-running at all, and it returned almost instantly. But you can imagine that there'd be much more complex operations, much slower web servers that would take longer to return. And in that case, it would be useful, especially if you're running many flows at once, to be able to surrender the flow worker thread and allow it to perform other work while you're waiting for this to return. So there you have it. Those are two of the new flow features being introduced in Corda 4.4. So the first we saw was the ability for the developer to decide programmatically when a flow needed to be sent to the flow hospital for retry. And the second one was the ability to suspend a flow thread programmatically in case you want to perform some long-running operation like reaching out to some external system or doing some very expensive computation.